So, what's so great about the Great Depression? Why do they call it that? Any idea? You don't know, Holly. Why would they call it that? If you don't stub your toe and go, "Wow, that was a great toe stubbing," what happened?
Well, great doesn't mean like fabulous or superb. It's more like large. So
Right.
as in, like huge.
So length of time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Bingo.
And like number of people.
Actually, unfortunately, there had been depressions in the United States, particularly at the end of the 19th century, that had that kind of impact on the workforce. It was the length. That was the issue. A 10-year depression is kind of hard to fathom. That has that kind of depth to it. Particularly, so the two things about the depression that we should really have in our minds in order to kind of get a sense of it. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So let me have all of you, yeah, you guys raise your hands, okay? Yeah. So, not you, Daniel. So the people with their hands raised, so that means that any room that you walked into, thank you, of this size, that many people would be unemployed and or potentially homeless. Okay? It's sort of like getting your mind around the idea of the number of people that died or were displaced during the Civil War. There were so many people that died during the Civil War or were displaced that if you were your age and you went into a room, it would be impossible to be in a class and not come out the other side with somebody dead or multiple people dead. It would be impossible to be in any social setting without having a physical knowledge, close proximity, personal knowledge of many people unemployed that you knew, that had almost no options as to where to live. The numbers are really difficult to actually get a handle on because obviously this wasn't a time when people were as connected as they are now. So now we have a very clear sense of who's unemployed, who's homeless, etc. Even that said, there are people that sort of quote-unquote drop out of the workforce. In other words, they had a job, they lost their job, they're no longer looking for a job because they're living off their parents or living off their husband or living off their wife or whatever it is. And so they're they quote-unquote dropped out of the workforce, meaning they're no longer applying for unemployment benefits. And that's one of the main ways that we track unemployment in this country now. There are also people that cannot apply for unemployment benefits because they never had that kind of job to begin with. Or maybe their employer managed to get rid of them without making it seem like they got laid off. They don't feel like they could get unemployment benefits, and so they're not a part of that calculation either. So even within the computer age, it's difficult for us to get a full sense of that. And yet, in 1930, none of those resources were at our disposal. And so how many people were really unemployed? We can only imagine it was much worse. Okay? On top of the unemployment and the subsequent homelessness, because there was absolutely no social safety net in the United States whatsoever. The only social safety net, welfare, housing benefits, anything like that existed was all on a charity basis, mostly through churches, okay, or within a community itself. That said, communities and people within those communities tended to be much more likely if somebody just literally came by their house seeking, help, food, to take someone in to offer them that. It was a little less of a urban sort of, that wasn't as unusual a situation, particularly in the smaller communities. And that would have been the case in a place like Bridgewater. If people would literally be reduced to going door to door to try to get some food. to feed their family, or find somewhere that they could stay in someone's barn or whatever it was. And so there ended up being a lot of people kind of on the road, migrating, looking for any kind of employment that they could find. My grandfather was a migrant, ended up being a migrant worker for a period of time, picking strawberries and whatnot in the southern part of Illinois and the southern part of Indiana. And they literally had the people that picked that fruit just sleep in the field. And if you can imagine, if you've ever tried to sleep outside on a summer night in Massachusetts, it's a pretty buggy experience. You can almost imagine how mind-bendingly buggy it would be to be sleeping in a blackberry field or a raspberry field in the middle of the summertime in the South. And people got terribly sick. My grandfather among them caught malaria from that situation. People were so desperate, it is hard for us to imagine that level of desperation. Almost the entire southern part of Central Park in New York became a shanty town, of squatters, people living in thrown together cardboard boxes, things, shelters that were built out of basically garbage that they had found or things that they were able to pull off of other buildings. Again, that's where my grandfather sort of started out in Chicago, and ultimately was able to, get a tenement apartment and get better, although it was a difficult struggle up. How many people have ever heard stories from their families or their parents or anything, or it wouldn't have been your parents, but maybe your grandparents or anything about the Depression or about the situation during the Depression? Brittany, I saw your hand first. What kind of things came down through your sort of oral history in your family?
It was like actually one of my teachers in high school.
Mm-hmm.
My mom was from New York, and like she wasn't. I think she was only like 6 years old, but like they lived in New York.
Mm-hmm.
It was when like I don't know what it's called, but like everyone lived in like that like the center of New York City and like boxes, and it was like. So she told us about that. And, like,
Hoovervilles, they call them. Yeah. I think you see that kind of poverty now, mostly in the third world. We see images of that kind of poverty come out of Central America, Central Asia, etc. That was a really new thing to the United States, which was a country that had a lot of natural resources. So prior to that experience, people had a very clear notion that if you just worked hard and followed the rules, you would have some measure of ability to make a living. Albeit it was hard as a working person in the United States in the early 20th century because there were very few work rules. That the 8-hour day had only recently come along. People were worked a lot of hours, and a lot of the work was dangerous. At the turn of the century, 1 in 11 people who worked in the steel industry was killed on the job. That is a staggering number, in my opinion. 1 out of 11. So if you went to work in a steel mill, you had a 1 in 11 chance of surviving your work in the steel mill. So things getting worse from there was a shock to people. And there's just inability for an able-bodied person to go out and get what it took to just feed their family or themselves. You can imagine the level of frustration and the potential in a very urban population. Remember we were talking about how the country was getting more urban as time went on? So it's sort of a powder keg. And again, the weird situation here is that not only didn't the country fall into some sort of revolution situation, not that Americans aren't, perfectly capable of revolting or overthrowing their government. They had, in their history already. And many other countries that had a similar demographic to the United States did exactly that. Certainly in Germany it happened. Certainly in Italy it happened. There was a lot of labor unrest in England, but it didn't ultimately topple. It toppled the government in its own way, but didn't change the whole system of government. And then, of course, not that many years previously, the entire government, the whole way that Russia had been governed, had been completely changed. So in the wake of World War I, which was a really devastating experience for the Europeans particularly, governments just changed completely. The French government was socialist. There was a lot of fundamental structural change to the way people were governing themselves in Western societies. But that didn't happen here. There was a change, but it wasn't on the level of radicalism. We didn't become a communist country. We didn't become a socialist country. And that possibility certainly existed in a very big way. What do you think stopped that from happening? What do you know about that period of history that may have made a difference in keeping us on the track to the way we ended up having our society as opposed to having a complete revolution? Politically.
I know, like, midway through, like, the Depression in 1934, Germany started to rearm itself because Hitler started to come up in power, and, like, coming into, like, the beginning of World War II.
Absolutely had an effect. Yeah. We didn't feel the economic effect of that until the late 1930s, when we started Lend-Lease and building weapons for the British. So that would have been 39, 30, 40. Okay? But there's something that happened a little earlier on politically in the United States that tended to turn the situation around. Although it didn't turn the economic situation completely around, it definitely kept the country from falling into some sort of revolution. Does anybody know about any of the political figures of the early part of the Depression? Any presidential figures that they know of?
FDR.
Yeah. So FDR was elected and took office in the beginning of 1933 and had a plan called the New Deal, which was pretty revolutionary in the sense that prior to the New Deal, the idea that the government was really involved in your life in a substantial way didn't really exist in the United States. There was the beginning of the notion that the government could do some marginal good and shape some things in terms of how people lived their lives, in terms of the amount of work they did, the safety on the job, curbing large trusts, etc. And that was the work of Teddy Roosevelt, who was actually politically on the entire other spectrum than FDR. But in the interim, there hadn't been a lot of substantive change about that. FDR basically said he, as the head of the government, was going to put an enormous amount of people to work right away. And they were just going to borrow the money and do it. Now, we could argue a long time about whether that had, what kind of real effect that had in the long term, economically speaking. Ultimately, by 1936, the unemployment figures had changed somewhat, but not remarkably. So there was still a terrible depression in 1936. The difference was people didn't feel like the society was going to come unglued. They had some hope. They had some measure of hope. And FDR above all things, partly because of his own personal history of overcoming polio. He had contracted polio. He was essentially paralyzed from the waist down the entire time that he was in office. He was able to sort of finesse that in a way that made it look as if he was able to get around independently somewhat. But FDR really had almost no use of his legs, and he was in excruciating pain most of his life after polio, trying to get around. And people knew it on some level. I don't think a lot of Americans were aware that their president was completely handicapped in that regard. But certainly as the war went on, people began to see very visibly that FDR was suffering and that he was in a lot of pain and that he had a very, very difficult time getting around. That said, Americans felt very deeply for him because he felt very deeply for them. And he had overcome something that could happen to anybody. Polio was a disease at that time. You weren't. Now we all get vaccinations for it. It was a terrible disease. It killed children. It killed people. He contracted it as an adult, and it was just a part of the society. It was a part of living in that period, and it had touched everyone. Almost no one in America would not have known someone who had contracted polio or some child that had died from polio. So FDR sort of overcoming this became something that, in a way, people could connect to, and they say, well, he might have been born rich, but at the end of the day, he got dealt a card that any one of us could have got dealt, and it didn't knock him down. He's got this indomitable spirit. And he had this air of positivism that was infectious, and he, as a politician, but just as a person and as a speaker, he conveyed this sense that the country was going to pull out of this. We were going to, happy days would be here again, and that we had nothing to fear but fear itself. And to be honest, it's not like the money had evaporated. I mean, yes, when the stock market crashed, there was a lot of imaginary money out there. Stocks had been inflated in value. There was a bubble, and literally within a day, the half of the value or more of the stock market just disappeared because it never existed. It was just stocks had been run up way above their real performance. So yes, that money was gone, and people were, prior to that, hiring people, making promises, making commitments on money that they really didn't have in cash in their hand. And one of the first things that Franklin Roosevelt did was declare what they call a bank holiday. Now, we go to the bank now and we just expect that if we put money into the bank, we could, go online or whatever and get that money out. Okay? And part of that is through a program that FDR created called the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which insures all deposits under $100,000 in your bank account. So you know that you'll get your money back unless the government disappears. Okay? But prior to the FDIC existing, prior to the New Deal, your deposit in that bank was only as good as the bank. So if the bank put a out of business, we're closed sign on their door, gone was your money. Okay? And that made a huge difference to people because there was actually a culture of saving. It wasn't as easy to get mortgages or credit or those kinds of things in the United States, so people saved money. If they were going to buy a house, they saved up their money in a bank account, in a savings account, until they had their deposit, they could pay for the house. So this devastated people, not just economically, but emotionally. If you spent, if you'd gone, you work in construction, right? So are you in renovation or what? What's the main kind of construction you do?
Basically, it's like contracting, but it's a general contractor.
Right. You were doing concrete work the other day. Right. So you go to work and you do concrete work, which is dirty, messy. You get the concrete on your hands. It dries your hands out. There's a lot, and it's not to mention in certain form laying, I'm sure, dangerous to some degree. And you do that work over and over and over and over and over again, and you chip out just a little bit of money and you stick it in the bank so that you and your girlfriend, who you want to marry, can get that little house that you had an eye on. Not a big house, but a little house over there in East Bridgewater, and you're like, You're going to nail that house at some point. You've been trotting down to the bank with that little bit that you're able to carve out because you're living with your folks, but you haven't gotten married yet. The reason you haven't gotten married is because you're saving for that house, right? You don't want to live with your folks when you get married. That's nothing romantic about that, right? And then all of a sudden you go down to the bank and there is no bank. And then you think, well, wait a minute. I know where that banker lives. He lives in that big house up on the hill. How come he has that house and I don't have my money? In that scenario, how long do you think that banker and that banker's family was going to live? Okay? Particularly in a country that's not afraid to have a lot of weapons. So there were a lot of people that didn't survive that part of the Depression in the Midwest. There were people that came in Minnesota and Illinois to take people's farms away, and they just hung them at the auction. They were going to have an auction off the farm, and instead they just put up a scaffold and they took those bankers and they hung them right there. And they said, anybody that comes down and comes down to get our farm, the next person that comes, we're going to hang them up. And then you can come and see if you can find all of us, or put a court together, or a jury together that will convict any of us. So that was what Franklin Roosevelt walked into the middle of. Banks were full. At that time, the Depression had been going on. The stock market crash was in 1929. Franklin Roosevelt didn't take office until January 1933. He took office a little early even because it was such an emergency. Usually, prior to that, as I understand it, president didn't come in until March. But instead, he came in January. And he immediately declared what they call a bank holiday. Because people had been going down to the bank and lining up and trying to get their money back. Well, if you go down to the bank today, if we all went down to Eastern Bank today, every Eastern Bank customer, we said, we want all the money that we have in Eastern Bank in cash right now. How long do you think Eastern Bank would have cash? Not very long. They don't have all that money laying around. People didn't understand that. So there was no money. That money was tied up in people's mortgages. There was no secondary mortgage market at that point to speak of. So the bank had loaned that money. And if those loans were no good, they couldn't just, and so they had to start calling those loans in. So they had some money. That's what had sent them out to Minnesota to get that land auctioned off. On top of that, there was an enormous drought in the West that lasted the better part of 8 years. A drought on a scale no one had ever seen before. So much so that when the wind blew across Oklahoma and places like that, literally it would blow the layer of topsoil right off the fields, partly because of bad practices in agriculture. My grandfather took a train, he worked for the railroad, took a train all the way across the United States. At one point the train stopped and he said to the conductor, "Why is the train stopped in the middle of nowhere?" He said, and the conductor said, "This isn't the middle of nowhere, this is a station." And he looked out the window and there was so much dirt in the air he couldn't see the station. He couldn't see the train platform. It just looked like dirt. People died from it, from inhaling it. So it was a terrible situation. So FDR pauses the banks, gives them a chance to regroup, gives people a chance to settle down, and it was almost a voluntary thing. He told people just to calm down. Don't go to the bank. Don't try to get your money back. You'll get your money back. Now today, people, we're very cynical about politicians for good reason. We would just be like, okay, you wait, I'm going to go. But people did. They knew they had to come together or there was going to be catastrophe, worse than what they had already experienced. And so people literally voluntarily stopped demanding their cash back, and ultimately the banks were able to get a footing and solvency was able to be restored, and then it was followed up with an insurance program to insure deposits. A lot of the things that happened in the New Deal, the recovery things, happened on a semi-voluntary basis. People bought into them through an enthusiasm for people pulling together and surviving the crisis. And I think we've all seen evidence of that, however cynical we are as human beings, when there's a hurricane, when there's a big disaster. It's fascinating. Americans feel that they're a very cynical group of people, etc., but they have an incredibly high rate of philanthropy. And when there's crises, there's a pouring out. People like no other country in the world in terms of donating money, donating their services, people going abroad to try to help in crises. So people pulled together. It was an emergency, and FDR sort of was the person who happened to be at the right point, the right person at the right time to get people pulled together. For that reason, he was the longest serving president in history. No president will ever serve as long as FDR. He was elected to, my understanding, he was elected to 4 terms in office. I think that's right. 32, 36, 40, and 44. Correct. He died in office. And after that, they passed an amendment limiting the amount of time that people could serve. Not because he was anything but beloved, but I think everybody agreed that was too much. So that's the sort of political landscape to some extent. I mean, that's, you know, the Depression in 15 minutes for y'all. But the sort of political meets the art edge here is that one of the things that Roosevelt created was something called the Works Progress Administration, and within that was something called the Federal Theater Project. Now, the Works Progress Administration covered lots of different things. It didn't just cover the arts. It covered, it built schools, they built dams, they built huge projects. Some of the biggest hydroelectric projects that the world had ever seen, certainly up to that point, and still has ever seen, were created under the WPA. And it was a way of building infrastructure in the country and getting people back to work on a massive level. Okay, these were labor-intensive projects. Some of them were very were high-tech projects. The Tennessee Valley Authority was an attempt to just electrify a part of the country that was still very rural, very poor, but had a lot of hydroelectric capacity, potentially, up to that point untapped. So these projects were something brand new for the government to be involved in, and, you know, controversial, but at the same time did unquestionably put a paycheck into the hands of millions of Americans. Okay? Which was a tipping point, enough to get people feeling like things are getting better. And, you know, economics tend to be very personal. You know, 20% unemployment can feel like, you know, when you're unemployed, it ain't 20% unemployment, it's 100% unemployment for you. Okay? So when you have a job, 20% unemployment can make you feel very down in the mouth, but if you've got the job, you're like, but I'm all right today. And if you can get enough people with a paycheck in their pocket and spending, you can actually get things going again, which was definitely the theory. And it worked to a certain extent. There were dips and levels. But as Austin pointed out, what really ultimately turned the economic situation around was the war in Europe and the fact that America became what we call the arsenal of democracy. And even here in a place like Massachusetts, we build a lot of weapons, still do, and certainly up in Watertown, they went to work hard to build the weapons to fight the war in Europe. So Roosevelt creates the WPA, and within it, he has this idea that there are parts of American culture which simply will go unrecognized and unpreserved unless a government entity steps in and says, hey, we want to make sure we see this stuff. We want to make sure we document this stuff. We want to make sure this stuff gets out to the public because it doesn't have a commercial value. Now, this wasn't completely foreign to people. Certainly the sort of quote-unquote robber barons of the Gilded Age, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, they understood that there was some art in America that wasn't profitable. Opera, ballet, etc. That it needed philanthropy. It needed to be supported by people who had money. But the idea that should be something that was available to everybody, that wasn't really a pervasive concept the way it is now. Beyond that, the people that Franklin Roosevelt tapped, because Franklin Roosevelt was a person who didn't believe in just grabbing the good old boys up. He actually reached out to more people of color, more women were in his administration than any administration in history up to that point, more people of various religions, particularly Jews who had been very, very kept out of government up to that point, as well as kept out of many universities. Suddenly, these people were invited into the administration, and they had ideas that were not, particularly mainstream, but in a weird way, very American. Not in a weird way, they were very American. And some of these people, one of them, Hallie Flanagan, became the head of the Federal Theater Project. And Hallie had been somebody who was a very bootstrap kind of gal, super, super hardworking, and she had gone out and she was kind of a theater self-historian. There wasn't really, you couldn't really major in theater in those days. She had sort of self-educated herself in the theater in an almost academic way. And she had done things like go to Russia to see the Moscow Art Theater and meet with Konstantin Stanislavski, one of the founders of the Moscow Art Theater, who ultimately was the person who had responsible for the greatest innovations in acting of the century, maybe of history. Okay? And so she really had a sense of what theater was. But mostly, she had a real love of American theater, and she believed that there was something about American theater that was different than any other theater anywhere in the world. And she, unlike most people, knew that because she had seen a lot of theater all over the world. Okay? And that jived with what Franklin Roosevelt felt about American culture. He had spent a lot of time in places like Georgia, in rural Georgia, and he had a sense that there was a sort of authenticity in the countryside, outside of the cities of the United States. There was a real Americana, a real American culture, but you had to sort of get it, and you had to hold on to it, because as people became urbanized, they sort of became homogenized. You know what I mean by homogenized? What does that mean? Daniel, what do I mean by that? You know what that word means. Come on, man. If I told you people, when people get into a sort of urban setting, or they all sort of come together, they tend to make a little bit of money, sort of middle class money, they kind of, what do you think happens to their tastes? What do you think happens to the more mass media they consume, etc.? It gets more expensive. I think you're right. Yeah.
It's like all the same.
It tends to kind of, homogenize. It tends to become kind of all the same. Okay? Mass media tends to crank out, popular media tends to crank out stuff that's going to appeal to a lot of different people. And for that reason, it sort of smooths off the rough edges. Okay? Whereas what the people that Franklin Roosevelt put in charge of the Federal Theater Project, the Federal Music Project, the Federal Art Project, they weren't interested in smoothing out the rough edges. They were interested in finding the stuff that had rough edges. because they felt that that stuff was very iconoclast, it was very original, very authentic, and they wanted to make sure that people had access to it and that it was preserved. So you had somebody like Alan Lomax, who literally took a great big piece of sound recording equipment, put it in the back of his car, paid for by the Federal Theater Project, although he had previously done it for Columbia Records, and literally just drove all over the United States to the back fields of the South and recorded people playing field music, playing blues music. Ultimately, he came in contact with some of the greatest interpreters of field music and blues music in the 20th century. Huddie Ledbetter, Blind Lemon Jefferson, recorded them, ultimately got Huddie out of prison in Texas, brought him to New York, and people became exposed to this music, which was very American, very authentic. The world had never heard anything like it, and ultimately this became the music that a lot of people associate with the United States. Blues music, rock and roll came out of it. Okay? Because this music was very gutsy, very gritty, very down to earth, had a lot of intonations that had come from this weird amalgamation of gospel rhythms, which were church rhythms that had been changed and used, and also this sort of 4-chord, 4/4 time, very easy to connect with, had a good hook to it, and this just changed everything. But again, this was a byproduct in a weird way of having some resources to go out and really, and again, Franklin Roosevelt was adamant about, we have got to capture this stuff before it disappears. That this was this America of people being out on the plains and cutting the sod and making the fields, and making America happen, the cowboys and all of that. Ansel Adams, who shot pictures for the Federal Art Project, people just were sent out across America to just photograph America. The West as it was. Native American tribes that were disappearing. People that were still living traditional ways of life that people in the cities had never seen, but that still existed at the beginning of the 20th century. Our very comprehension of our own history became shaped by the fact that some resources were finally being dedicated to doing things like this, so that we had a sense later of ourselves. And FDR believed that if people had a sense that America was something that was complex and original and authentic and filled with vibrancy and filled with power, they would want to come together, hang on, and make it work. And in a weird way, it was the ultimate preparation for what came about later, which was World War II and the greatest struggle for democracy that the world had ever seen. So these people were brought together. They were taught what America was in a profound way, and ultimately had to go and defend and give their lives to defend it. So, as it turned out, it was the preparation that the country needed. But of course, FDR didn't know that, and nobody else knew that at that point. Now, from a theatrical point of view, Hallie Flanagan goes out, and there are federal theater projects in every major city in the United States. There's also a black federal theater project and a white federal theater project. So what they call the Negro Theater Project. Some of the people who you might recognize, how many people have ever heard of the War of the Worlds, the movie, or the event? What do you remember of that? When I say War of the Worlds, what jumps out?
I think of those those ships coming out of the ground.
Mm-hmm. People from Mars. And what do you know about what actually happened with all that? Do you know anything about the background of War of the Worlds or the story? Go ahead.
Wasn't it just like a broadcast of like someone reading a story, but people tuning in didn't know it was a story?
Yeah, it was a radio broadcast.
Yeah.
Yep, Mercury Theater, and Orson Welles had a program on the radio, called the Mercury Theater. And he'd been working for the Federal Theater Project. The Mercury Theater was a commercial thing with the radio. But he got people, it was a radio drama. How many people have ever heard a radio drama before? Not too many. Occasionally you hear these things on public radio. Just like listening to a drama. Like, you know, basically don't look at just listen to the movie, you know, don't watch it. Okay? And, you know, sound effects, actors portraying different things. And it was, unlike a lot of radio dramas up to that point, it was pretty realistic. They had, they broke in, it sounded like it was a real news broadcast. People believed it. And if they didn't catch the first few minutes of it, they didn't know it was a radio drama. They just thought it was the newscast. So people ended up going out to New Jersey and looking for the Martians with their guns. I mean, it was crazy. And, you know, Orson Welles ultimately got into some trouble for it. He also got wicked famous for it. Okay? And it propelled him. He was able to create some things in New York that no one else was able to create, including a mixed-race version of Macbeth that was partially sponsored by the Federal Theater Project, which was sort of took place in the Caribbean. The Emperor Jones, which he had a hand in, along with John Huston producing, which had the name is going to escape me, but we were just studying him. God, I'm terrible about these names. Names come and go from my head. But from a musical standpoint, people were able to get some money and some support to just do some writing that they might not otherwise have been able to do because they were no longer tied to this notion that everything had to be a commercial success. Okay? Likewise, like I was telling you before, it's a funny thing that happens during really hard economic times. There tend to be two sort of polarities. On the one hand, there's a sort of desire for escapism. On the other hand, there's a desire for something that connects to them with this degree of reality that approximates the sort of reality, the intense reality people are experiencing in their daily lives. People aren't just sort of bouncing along in their daily lives, so they need something that really grabs them. They also, for the first time in theatrical history, political subject matter, which previously was completely not okay, not only on Broadway, but even in terms of music publishing. Overly political music, the publishers just self-censored it. They wouldn't sell it. But now, the biggest hit of the period is Buddy, Can You Spare a Dime? Which was, Bing Crosby recorded it later. It was in a Broadway musical. Okay? Gershwin takes musicals that, a musical that had opened and closed in 1927 that has a highly political theme, and you'll see some of it in the video. And suddenly it wins a Pulitzer Prize when it's produced on Broadway. Because people are upset. They're pissed off. And they find a vent for that in the theater. The theater suddenly becomes a medium. Now, we feel like that would happen all the time in movies nowadays. If there's a huge political thing, a war, an economic crisis, we see tons of movies about it. How many people any of you ever see The Company Men? The movie The Company Men? No? See? Nobody's seen my movie.
I've seen it.
You've seen it, yeah. Well, there was a Ben Affleck, Kevin Costner, several other people were in it as well. Tommy Lee Jones, etc. But shot in Boston, and it was a perfect example of, you know, in the middle of the economic crisis, a big star-driven piece, although it wasn't a particularly big-budget film, around the idea of people losing their jobs and how the hell they were going to cope with all that. So the theater starts to respond in that way. And that's on the one hand. On the one hand, we have these, Gershwin, Ethel Merman, who becomes a big star of the period. She's in these pieces. Musical reviews that previously were just basically comedy and maybe even minstrelly, along with songs. Now all of a sudden they're like political sketch comedy and musics and political driven music or socially aware driven music. So that's over here on the one hand. And in the midst of this, although people would argue it's not necessarily political, but it definitely is edgy and socially edgy, probably the most significant piece of work written maybe in the entire 20th century is written by George Gershwin during this period, and that is Porgy and Bess. And Porgy and Bess is a kind of, it's an American opera. For all intents and purposes, it is the first real piece of high art that is ever created in the United States that is world renowned, that becomes world renowned. As good as anything created in Europe or anywhere else. It's George Gershwin's masterpiece. It is a beautiful, beautiful piece of work. It has music in it that I think you might even recognize, songs like Summertime. It is a decidedly mixed racial experience. It has got all of the gritty aspects of American culture revealed. But it's an incredible story, and you'll get to learn a lot more about it, so I'm not going to go into great detail. The other sort of pole of this is this desire to sort of escape the realities of the Depression by coming into a theater and paying your money and seeing something glamorous and seeing something fun and light. And the sort of clearest expression of that side of the coin is Cole Porter. And Cole Porter is born into a wealthy family. Cole Porter never really struggles as growing up, not certainly like George Gershwin had to. And he has a very different sense of what should be on the Broadway stage. His sense, he's a kind of what they call a bon vivant, kind of a playboy, gadabout, runs around the, hot spots of Europe, Monte Carlo, etc. in the midst of the Depression. His feet never touch the ground, but he's an incredibly hard worker. He's incredibly talented, and he creates sort of the biggest expression of that side of it would be a musical called Anything Goes. So it takes place on a passage liner. At that time, people, if they wanted to travel between Europe and the United States, the only way to do it was essentially to take a boat. And so you would be on that boat for days with that group of people. And so this is a sort of glamorized version of what that would all be about. And again, Anything Goes, loaded with songs that if there was any songs that you would recognize from that era, they would be from Anything Goes or from Porgy and Bess. So we have these two sort of competing kinds of experiences. This is absolutely reflected throughout the cultural experience of this period, in every single thing. Whether it's music, art, straight plays, musicals, on the one hand, you have a sort of escapism. On the other hand, you have this sort of brand new ability to create politically and socially aware art and have people that really wanted to consume it. And not only people that maybe wanted to consume it, because I would suggest that those people always existed, but you have people willing to produce it. And critics that are willing to embrace it, which is substantial if you want to not lose every penny you put into a show. So the critics had an enormous amount of power. you might have thought your Porgy and Bess was a masterpiece, but if the critics just weren't ready to see that kind of gritty material and they panned the hell out of it, other than the people that were at the theater that night, your show might not be open for a second night. Because it costs a lot to keep that show open, and people aren't going to keep throwing good money after bad. So many shows in New York, particularly, because the media, and we think of the media today of being sort of instantaneous, things going viral. Well, in Broadway, by this time, the media had become so ingrained in the viewer, within the culture of entertainment, and there were so many options that people very much turned to the reviews, and the main reviews that came out, if you got panned, it was over for you. The theater would literally close down. So the idea that the society changed enough that people were able to get this kind of material, this material got a sort of a foothold, it enabled theater companies like the Group Theater to produce shows like Waiting for Lefty and Golden Boy, which may not jump out at you as titles, but the people that came out of the schools that were formed by members of the Group Theater, Stella Adler and Lee Strasberg, people like Marlon Brando, Meryl Streep, the list goes on and on, Al Pacino, et cetera, et cetera. Robert De Niro, these people were trained by members of the Group Theater. And the Group Theater was able to produce the work that they wanted to produce, the gritty, hyper-realistic, natural, very American material. And that was really their ethos. They wanted to do plays that were about the American experience. They didn't want to do drawing room comedies imported from England. And that was a brand new thing. People didn't know, people wanted to see that. You know, there was that escapism idea out there, you know. So, that's what makes this period exciting. In a weird way, the desperation that comes from the kind of economic disaster that the country suffered engendered a need, as perceived by some key leaders, FDR among them, certainly Hallie Flanagan, who ultimately ended up in charge of the program at University of Massachusetts and Amherst. This idea that, well, we have to come together as a people in order to survive this. And the way to do that is to use art as a way of unifying the country. In a way that George Gershwin had already started doing with his music, by combining all these different rhythms and ideas and bringing all these different things together and making it work as a hit, kind of gave people the idea, hey, music, theater, this kind of thing is the kind of thing that can bring people together. We've got to tap into this so that we can survive this crisis. And this idea carries on beyond the Depression, because ultimately the very people who took so much out of the country but also created a lot of wealth in the country, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, some of these people who were wealthy on a level that we can't even imagine. I mean, at one point, I think the number I heard was that John Rockefeller, at one point, J.P. Morgan bailed out the United States of America with his bank. The country was bankrupt. The only way that the country was able to survive another year was when J.P. Morgan lent the United States money. That's how wealthy he was at the turn of the century. Something like a tenth of the economy of the United States was tied up in John Rockefeller's holdings at the turn of the century. That's unthinkable. We think of, Bill Gates and people like that as being wealthy. These people were wealthy on a level we can't even imagine. But they ultimately used that wealth, and the Rockefeller Foundation that was created took this idea, even though John Rockefeller was no fan of Franklin Roosevelt, but he took this idea that art can unify the country, and created the Rockefeller Foundation, which was ultimately the greatest supporter of the arts in terms of dollars, even more than the federal government by the middle of the 20th century. And many of the institutions of this country, artistic institutions like the Lincoln Center, the Kennedy Center, Carnegie Hall, certainly, that was built by Andrew Carnegie. These were built by the very people who would have been in opposition to Franklin Roosevelt when he came into office, but still believed in this idea that art, music, and theater can unify the population, can unify the country, and bring us together as a people. And so they were willing to dedicate enormous sums of money to do just that in the public good. So that's my spiel. I'm going to stick with it. You guys have